Donald Trump has officially hit back at Russia. If a ceasefire with Ukraine is not reached within 50 days, Moscow will face 100% secondary sanctions.
And we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. You'd call them secondary tariffs. You know what that means.
But what does this tough message mean? Can it really stop this war? The threat is seen as one of the clearest signals of support for Ukraine, which has been struggling on the battlefield in recent months. But it's not just about Trump's outburst. It has the potential to affect geopolitical balances, energy markets, and the global economy. In this meeting, Trump also announced billions of dollars in arms aid to Ukraine through NATO. We will discuss this in more detail in a moment. Now, the question is this really Trump's strategic turn? During and after his presidency, Trump was known as a leader who often made soft and even complimentary remarks about Vladimir Putin. Putin and I had a great relationship. We understood each other, etc., in an attempt to avoid direct confrontation with Moscow. His foreign policy language was more about dealing with strong leaders. This was one of the most striking differences between Trump and traditional politicians in the West. However, the developments of the last 2 weeks have swept away this soft and pragmatic tone. It has been replaced by a threatening, direct, and aggressive rhetoric. Trump seems to have realized that Putin is not just a diplomatic table talker. He is systematically pursuing a much broader and dangerous agenda behind the scenes.
I don't want to say he's an assassin, but he's a tough guy. It's been proven over the years.
Initially, Trump's vision was more conciliatory. Painful but short-term peace formulas such as Ukraine not joining NATO and the de facto cession of some occupied eastern regions to Russia. He even assumed that such a deal could both save Moscow's face and prevent the West from being drawn directly into war. However, it has become clear over time that Putin's goals are not limited to this. The Kremlin's long-term strategy is not only to occupy Ukraine's territory, but also to destroy the country's entire sovereignty and push the West back politically, economically, and militarily. Faced with this reality, Trump has been forced to change his rhetoric and posture. But is this strategic shift really permanent, or is it just a tactical stunt for the election period? This is where the real debate begins. Because Trump's track record has shown a leader who can change according to momentary developments rather than a consistent foreign policy line. While his current stance seems both reassuring to the West and challenging to Putin, only time will tell whether this will translate into a real strategy. And what was Russia's reaction? Trump's threat resonated strongly in Moscow. However, the Kremlin's response was unexpectedly sarcastic and condescending. Former President Dmitry Medvedev, one of Putin's closest figures, made a direct reference to Trump on his X account. Medvedev's words were remarkable. Trump issued a theatrical ultimatum to the Kremlin. The world was shuddered, expecting the consequences. Belligerent Europe was disappointed. Russia didn't care. This statement made it clear that the Kremlin does not take Trump's threats seriously and sees the U.S. language of pressure as ineffective. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov struck a similar tone. He called Trump's threat of 100% secondary sanctions meaningless and unacceptable. Ryabkov said that such statements are incompatible with diplomatic practices in international relations. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, on the other hand, raised a more serious dimension of the issue. According to Peskov, Trump's remarks were personally conveyed to Vladimir Putin, and these messages were interpreted very clearly by Moscow. The U.S. president's statements are very serious. Some of the statements were aimed directly at President Putin. Of course, we need to analyze what is being said in Washington. The decisions taken in NATO countries are perceived by Ukraine as a signal for the continuation of the war, not peace. All these statements show that the Kremlin does not see Trump's threat as a military or economic crisis. On the contrary, the Russian side sees these statements as a propaganda and electoral move. However, this challenge signals that tensions could escalate further in the coming weeks. An example is the Russian airstrike on Ukraine on July 19th. Russia simultaneously targeted eastern and central Ukraine with more than 300 drones and missiles. This operation, described as the most intense airstrike of the year, affected 6 different regions. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, which suffered the heaviest damage, energy infrastructure was largely disabled. Approximately 80,000 households were left without electricity. Local authorities reported that the attack specifically targeted energy distribution centers and that the city grid was deliberately destroyed. At least 2 civilians were killed in the attacks. One of the casualties was reported to be a child only 8 years old. Search and rescue operations continued throughout the day to reach people reportedly trapped under the rubble. Residents spent the night in shelters and basements, while fire and medical teams were on duty in damaged areas. Local sources said the attack posed a direct threat to civilian infrastructure, and they feared an increase in casualties. While power outages continue in many regions of Ukraine, there are serious disruptions in communication and transportation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed Western allies in a statement on the X platform after the attacks. Russia is not changing its war strategy. The effective fight against this terrorism requires more air defense, more determination. The Ukrainian people must not be left alone. According to experts, this wave of attacks can be read as a direct response to Trump's outburst. While intimidating the West, the Kremlin continues to increase pressure on Ukraine. This situation is seen as part of Moscow's strategy to exert pressure not only on the front lines, but also in the diplomatic arena. At the same time, it is argued that Russia aims to create fear and uncertainty in Western public opinion with these attacks. Ukraine, however, continues to resist these threats and is demanding accelerated military aid from the West. In particular, civilian safety is at serious risk in areas where air defense systems are inadequate. These latest developments raise concerns that the war could escalate further. Trump chooses to help Ukraine on the surface. In a critical meeting with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump not only threatened tough sanctions against Russia, but also announced a new package of military aid to Ukraine. This package is much more comprehensive and strategic than previous aid. According to Trump's announcement, billions of dollars worth of modern weapons and defense systems will be delivered to Ukraine directly through NATO and in coordination with European countries. One of the most striking elements of this aid package is the Patriot air defense systems. These U.S.-made systems provide effective protection against high-altitude and long-range ballistic threats and are expected to significantly increase Ukraine's defense capacity, especially against Russian missiles. The aid package also includes high-precision long-range missile systems, electronic warfare equipment, armored vehicles, unmanned aerial systems, and radar technologies that are critical on the battlefield. This aid will enable the Ukrainian army to conduct more coordinated and effective operations by increasing its tactical flexibility in the field. In particular, electronic warfare systems will allow for the development of stronger countermeasures against Russia's communications and radar networks. Additionally, unmanned aerial systems will provide Ukraine with significant advantages in terms of reconnaissance and target identification. Armored vehicles will support the safe mobility of military units on the front lines. Overall, this package will make a significant contribution to Ukraine's efforts to modernize its defense infrastructure. But perhaps the most interesting and strategic aspect of this plan is not only that it provides aid to Ukraine, it also restructures NATO's arms stockpiles. According to Trump's plan, European countries will transfer their existing stocks of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to Ukraine. This would not only ensure a fast delivery, but also meet Ukraine's urgent needs. European countries would then replenish their own stockpiles with the next generation of U.S.-made weapons. This model not only helps Ukraine, but also represents a huge economic opportunity for the U.S. defense industry. Because at the end of this process, European countries will turn directly to American manufacturers for new supplies. This is also in line with Trump's long-standing rhetoric that NATO countries should spend more on defense. And what happens if Trump's 100% secondary sanctions are imposed? This would mean a massive wave of sanctions that could affect not only Russia, but all countries and companies that have direct or indirect economic, trade, or energy relations with Russia. Secondary sanctions basically mean the following. The United States reserves the right to impose an embargo not only on Russia, but also on any country, company, or financial institution that deals, trades, imports energy, or has financial relations with Russia. For example, Chinese, Indian, or Turkish companies that buy Russian oil, gas, or coal could lose access to the U.S. banking system, be prohibited from dealing in dollars, or have their assets seized in the United States under these sanctions. These three countries currently account for around 85% of Russia's oil exports. This shows that Trump's goal is clear, even if he does not name names. If Putin refuses to accept a ceasefire in the next 50 days and continues his aggressive behavior in Ukraine, the energy and trade relations of these three countries with Russia could be in deep trouble. If Russian oil and gas were withdrawn from the market, or if their flow were severely restricted, it would not only hurt Moscow, it would also upset the global supply-demand balance. This could lead to severe fluctuations in Brent oil prices, spikes in natural gas prices, and thus to energy crises on a global scale. According to experts, if such a scenario materializes, not only developing countries but also developed economies such as the U.S. and Europe would be affected. In the U.S. in particular, rising gasoline prices would not only reduce the purchasing power of the population, but could also become a source of serious discomfort for Trump's base ahead of the presidential elections. This is where a major contradiction emerges. While Trump's threats may seem politically powerful, economic realities make them difficult to implement. Because if Trump actually imposes these secondary sanctions, on the one hand, he could put pressure on Putin, but on the other hand, he could be the target of criticism in his own domestic politics for upsetting economic balances. But let's not forget, this is a threat. It is not known whether it will materialize. But do you think Trump will actually impose these sanctions? And could this change the course of the war? We welcome your comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe.